invitation to do that. And now I'm going to introduce, that was very smooth. Now I'm going to introduce one of our first-year MFA students who's working in sculpture and other things, Noe Olivas, to give the introduction for our speaker.
Thank you, Lauren, appreciate it. Today, I'm going to go by the name of Rumbo. It's Halloween, and this is the day that you get to become someone else, and I want to be mucho amor tonight, if that's okay. I'm going to get into this. Well, first of all, hello everybody. Happy Halloween. Rumbo. I specialize in the Rana style. Anyways, let me get back to this. Sorry, people. It's a great honor to introduce Fippo and Osorio. I'm very thankful to have you here, especially with the current crisis in your home country, Puerto Rico. Our deepest condolences as well in New York too. Fippo and Osorio is best known for large-scale installations, who uses different objects as well as video in his pieces to portray political and social issues in the Latino community. He was born in Santurce, Puerto Rico. He was educated in Universidad Interamérica in Puerto Rico and Herbert H. Hammond College in New York, and received his MA in Columbia University. Dude, I sound weird, huh? This thing sounds super weird. I think. What about now? How about, is it the cone? The cone, but this sounds more lucha libre. I lost my spot now. Let me get back into this. Let's see, Columbia University 85. Okay, Osorio's piece is influenced by his experience as a social worker in the Bronx. Yo, Bronx, tell me where you're from. The Bronx, that's what's up. If it wasn't for the Bronx, this rap shit probably wouldn't be going on, so tell me where you from. No, it's uptown, baby. Where it gets down, baby. Alright. I'm having too much fun with this mic in my hand. Give it up. Alright. Gotta get back into the script real quick. Usually it involves an interaction with neighbors and people amongst which he's working. He says, my principal commitment as an artist is to return art to the community, which that's amazing. I definitely take that one to the heart. A great example is the Tina House project, created in 1999 to 2000 in collaboration with the family recovering from a horrible fire. The house, a tabletop size art piece, tells the story of the night of the fire and those affected, and it travels It traveled in the country in a series of home visits, kind of like the posadas. If you don't know what the posadas are, look that up. That's your homework tonight. Because we're all required to be here, I gave you homework. A personal piece that I got to see in person this year at LACMA, and it was first featured in 1995 at Newark Museum, was the Badge of Honor. I hope you all got a chance to check that out. It's just an amazing piece. It was in the home exhibition for the Pacific Standard Time. Osorio is a MacArthur Fellowship recipient, a participant in the PBS Art 21 documentary. Look that up. That's an amazing little documentary. It's great. He has numerous solo exhibitions, including el Museo Nacional, Centro de Arte Reina Sofía en Madrid, la Escuela de Arte Plásticas en San Juan, the Institution of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. His works also include in travel exhibition Nia Hoodoo, Art the Forgotten Faith, co-organized by the Mineo Collection and PS1 Contemporary Art Center, and Voces y Visiones en el Museo del Barrio in 2010. Public collections include Brooklyn Museo de Arte, or sorry, Museum of Art. I mix my English and Spanish. That's tough. That's some real stuff right there. That's still a struggle. Anyway, Walker Art Center, the Whitney Museum of America, Museo de Arte in Puerto Rico, and National Museum of American Art. Please, everybody, warm welcome for Pebonos Osorio.
Thank you. What a hard act to follow.
I was so like he dimmed the lights. I don't think I'm going to do it. You guys are going to go to sleep now. Anyway, thank you for being here. And I know on Halloween night you probably had other choices to be. Although I understand now that some of you are required. So I'll make it light, funny. As a Puerto Rican, we save the best jokes for the wake. So I'm ready. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff down because I really wanted to be ready, and I wanted to thank Nao Bustamante for the invitation, but I also wanted to impress her. To make sure that she knew that I did the job, so here it is. But I'm not going to read anything, which also, it happens all the time. But I'll try to keep up with a little bit of what I said. And lately I've been thinking of my own evolution as an artist, and I'm glad you mentioned that in your eloquent introduction. The evolution from being a social worker or case worker into an artist, and what that means, and what it meant to me. And also thinking that an art practice takes a lifetime. And by just saying that, my sort of journey expanded. I would never probably retired, but just the thought of like, oh wait, I'm not done yet. So there's more to it. And lately, I have also, because of the crisis that you've mentioned in the island, I have been very much interested in people that desire change. I have been working with communities that believe that change is a possibility. And that's really, really hard. In fact, if anyone is religious here, my apology, but I curse here and there. So I'm just giving you the heads up. And on my way here, I was wondering if I'm more of a humanist than I am of an artist. What I do is that I placed empathy at the very, very core and center of my installation, of my practice, as a way for people to be able to see themselves, but also see a little bit of themselves in me and see a little bit of themselves in the work, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And very little is known about my process because of the conversations with museums and the conversations with the format of the exhibitions. Very seldom people understand the process of how to get there, and how the work is actually a debris of the process. So what you see is the very, very end, but we're very much interested in the very end, and the process is, for me, is the most important thing. I have to say this, Suzanne Lacey, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you, thank you. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience, and I tend to be long and non-linear, so bear with me. I'll make sure that somehow I run it up at the end and it makes sense. But for now, it's just going to be a little crazy. All right, I'm not going to read anything. I went to New York City to the Republic of the South Bronx in 1975. And it was because, as a person of African descent, as a Puerto Rican of African descent, and I'm sorry, this sounds very redundant, because all Puerto Ricans are of African descent, but for someone whose skin complexions were a little darker than everyone else around, my future was pretty much determined as an islander. And it was very much about what the society and the government wanted to see of me, and somehow I wrestled with that a lot, and decided to move out of Puerto Rico and go to supposedly New York City, but I ended up in the South Bronx, which is even worse, or better. And there, the summer before I made the decision to come to New York City, I met someone who was friend of a family, who had migrated many, many, many years ago before anyone else. She wasn't a family member, but I kept calling her aunt because I knew that that was my anchor to cross the Atlantic and get to the other side. And I kept calling her aunt, and she was really nice to me, and we hang out together all the time. And then finally I broke the news to my parents, and I told them I'm leaving. I'm heading out of here. I think that unconsciously both of my parents knew that, that I wasn't a very good fit for the island, that I had refused and resisted to the future that it was imposed on me as a colonized person. And my parents were very complacent, complacientes. They were, you know, they were like cats. Threw them up and they would land on their feet. And so that, I told them, my parents were, well, the only thing that you can do is just basically go to school. And it's interesting because this happens a lot in the island for the people that leave and use the excuse of the university as a reformatory, as a place to reform yourself and come back and make a lot of money, which is actually not true. But I left, and I left to the South Bronx, and I saw a reality that I'd never seen in my life before. I began to hang out with people that I've never even imagined, from other countries, from other places. I spoke only the present tense, not that my vocabulary is that expanded now. But for me, everything was the present tense. And people will ask me about the future. It's like, yeah, I go now. Nice. And so very little, but very curious. I've always been very curious about life and situations. So that aunt never told me that she was an activist. And we became very close. And I learned am a born-again Puerto Rican, to be honest with you, because somehow, somewhere, been in the island, in New York City, in the South Bronx, recontextualized my reality of who I am and what I am. And then I realized that the history that I had written, that seal, the Good Housekeeping seal that is placed on what is authentic, was no longer functioning. And that the Puerto Rican community in New York City was somehow a ghost of the island, right? And so I'm looking at this and realizing, damn, this is really interesting. And I'm looking at what it means to be a Puerto Rican in the context of a New Yorican reality, right? And that had an incredible impact in my work from then on. And I'm telling you all this because at some point I'm just going to reference this as you see it in the work. The majority of my pieces when I got to New York City was mostly a rupture. Somehow it felt like one of those tectonic shifts. That's how I see my work. And the layers, how they're layering on top of each other, and friction, a lot of movement. Because that's really my reality, what it's all about. Full of contradictions, if I may add. And so I started working. I went to Columbia University to do a master's. Don't do this. And maybe I should just be a little quiet, but this doesn't happen anymore. Thank God for affirmative action. I was in a school of social work, and I ended up in Teachers College doing a master's in the arts, and it was because I fell in love with Marianne, who is my wife and my longtime collaborator, and she said to me, I'm doing a master's in the arts. I was like, wow, that's great, me too. I don't know how to do it, but I'm doing that, I'm just after you, that's all. And so that's how I ended up doing my master's. But to be honest with you, I'm mostly a self-taught artist. self-taught at applying and somehow not only applying, but shifting a lot of the visual vocabulary through experience of the social realm. And so I come from a very poor family. Damn, this is going to take 2 hours. I come from a very poor family. My parents were working class. They've never visited a museum ever. And somehow, somewhere, this idea when I met Median about the arts was very convincing. It was very convincing because to me social work didn't work. It was about this institutional model, an institutional prescription that is often placed on people whose lives are very different from that prescription, right? And so when you try to mix that, all you do is you end up using all your budget in programs that actually don't work, because the reality somewhere is very different. So what I did was just basically seeing how, as a Puerto Rican, I was intervening with Puerto Rican families, and what I was saying was not very Puerto Rican. It was extremely different, and that really caused a serious trauma in me. And then I realized that shit didn't work, so I left. I left the Department of Human Services and went and worked on my own and began a completely self-taught idea. I tell you how little expectations I had of becoming an exhibition artist, that the majority of my work, and I don't know if this is familiar to you guys, but the majority of my work, and I kid you not when I say this thing, I would finish it and then I would dig it. I would just make a hole in the ground by a PS-39, which was a studio in the South Bronx, and buried my work because I didn't want to see it again. The notion of having something on the wall was out of the question for me, or having anything on exhibition was out of the question for me. So how I got to Columbia University was that I went back to all these places that I knew exactly where they were and dug out all the artwork and put them in. I put it in a paper bag, you know, like I don't know if you see this image or people like when they have their x-rays in a paper bag, that's what I look like. And I went and I told the guy, hey, listen, I want to come here. David told him the truth. I want to come here. Maxwell was his name. And he said, well, you know, show me what you got. Show me the portfolio. I'd never had a critique. I'd ever had any of that stuff. In fact, right now, I can count with one hand, with the fingers in one hand, how many curators have been to my studio. But anyway, I'm completely a different species. So I started that and I showed him the thing and he said, hey, this is really interesting. And he started to talk, theorize about the work. And I'm like, yeah, just give me the admission thing. I'm going to go and get out of here. And so finally, he said, you know, go downstairs to the first floor, talk to this lady. And I went, talked to the lady, and the lady said, you start tomorrow. And I'm like, I got on a payphone, called my Median, and say, hey, I'm in. And so that's how it happened. And that's what my life has been, a result of institutional flexibility and also a result of hard working, which comes from the ethics of my parents. I'll talk a little bit about this thing, and then I'll promise I'll get to this thing really soon. When I met Median comes from a family, her parents, her mom was an artist, her father was a doctor, a practicing doctor, and it was a completely different reality from my reality, like undoubtedly, right? And so Median exposed me to a lot of things. She used to live on Soho, that south of Houston in New York City, in a loft, and I was exposed to a lot of really wonderful people that I've never even imagined. Meredith Monk, Dana Wright, mostly performers. And at that time, I began to visit a lot of galleries in Soho, and I started to see Egnoguki, I started to see Julian Schnabel work. We're talking the 80s now. I don't know if this is even familiar to you guys, but all these different works by these 5 artists who control the art world at that time. And the same 5 artists that every time I saw this thing on the walls, I kept saying, okay, I'm not there. I don't see myself. What's going on? And the frustration mounted. And I started to look at possibilities outside of that. I was actually developing work, and I was with Merian, and I began to work in mostly performance. And I was very intrigued by how, well, the ephemeral aspects of performance and dance, but I was also interested in seeing how you can transform a space that reflected what I knew best, which was my community. I don't know if you know, I don't know how many of you have visited a Latino home, but I tell you, we have the TV on, we have the radio on, we have the microwave on, we have the stove on, we sing, we party with all of it at the same time, right? And that was the kind of a reality that I have lived all my life. But that's not what I was seeing in these places. So I just decided, I'm going to build my own shit. I'm going to do my thing, basically out of resistance and hard-headed that I am. And so this happened for 5 years. I just worked in performances. I resented it, the whole thing about going to museums and visiting a gallery, and did very, very, very few. In fact, I can't even remember in those years. I don't know if you know about the Decade Show. It was a show that was in New York City in the 80s. I was not included. It's just like, that's how invisible I built myself to be. And so I get an invitation. We're getting there. I got an invitation from a curator to have a retrospective at the Museo del Barrio, 104th Street. If you've never been there, go. My God, they have an amazing show right now by Belkis Ayong, a Cuban printmaker. Amazing, amazing work. And so I got an invitation, and we started to talk. And I went like nowhere to major exposure, right? The hidden gem, they call it, stuff like that. And so what happened was that we had a lot of discussion, because the intention of creating work, the intention of why I wanted to do what I wanted to do, I had never seen it represented in a museum. And so I felt like there was really no need for an exhibition. But also because I find that the conversation that I've had was much richer with the people of the immediate community than that of with the museum, right? The museum, the conversation that I always had, and I always feel that, I don't know why, I'm so resentful, but I always feel like a squatter. I just come in, plant this thing, and then I take off. And that's the conversation of going in and going out, and that's the amount of conversation that I have with museums. And when you go to a museum, you have a museum show, you're not having two, you're just having one. So that's it. There's no other opportunity. So that sounded a little fraudulent to me, and I began to explore all the things. And then she convinced me again, and finally I said, okay, let's do this. Weird, very, very strange, and I was not ready for this. And I'm not showing off. I'm not that kind of a person. But the New York Times wrote a review, Our in America wrote a review, Our Forum wrote, actually Coco Fusco wrote for Our America. And then suddenly I went everywhere and everybody knew my name. And I felt very, very uncomfortable about that. But anyway, I wanted to show you this. Thank you. This is part of the retrospective of Museo del Barrio. I'm going to do kind of an anecdotal presentation to tell you where I'm coming from, where I am. Can you see the slide? Okay. So, no, they're going to go to sleep. Turn it off a little. There you go, that's good. All right. You can still go to sleep. It was 5 years, and this is the last piece. And what I did with my work in the South Bronx was that I began to work with non-art professionals. All these non-art professionals that were around were part of my reality. I always remember visiting people's homes. So there's no coincidence that when you look at the work, my work is very domestic, and it's also speak of women. In many ways, I've been characterized as a feminist. But anyway, I don't take the credit for that. So what I did is that I invited for this exhibition, a retrospective, I invited two social workers to work with me who have worked with people that had AIDS. Now we're talking late 80s. In the late 80s, the AIDS epidemic hit really hard. Mid-80s, but the late 80s hit really hard, and too little came too late for people in communities of color. And so what I wanted to do was to actually I began to engage people in the process of it, similar, using the same methodology of social work, and engaging people in the process of making the work. So I visited a lot of people who were dying. I visited a lot of families. I shed a lot of tears, and it was a really interesting installation because as a citizen, I was ready. As an artist, I wasn't ready for this. And I wasn't ready for this because the opening night people came in and they were literally sobbing in front of the installation. And I began to have conversations with people about what it meant to be not only someone who was dying of AIDS, but someone who you knew because the institutional ignorance, you knew that your medication was not coming. And so this is the piece, and I'll show you more about the details. And again, the piece was probably about a little smaller than this room. 7 caskets, and I invited everyone from the community that I had spoken to help me build and do the flower arrangements. So at some point at the museo, and there's literally photos. Actually, I'm going to be saying a lot of stuff that it might sound very curious to you. I do not lie. Trust me, I do not lie. There's no reason for me to lie. So when I say all these things, they're real. And I invited a lot of people, and they came in, and we all together celebrated this whole thing. But what happens is, as an artist, I'm also placed in environments. I'm also going to places that are not accustomed to see artists. So I'm going to the funeral home. I'm going to the caskets where they sell the wholesale caskets and tell them that I'm going to do an installation. I've learned so much with my work. I was like, what's that? I'm like, okay, I got to explain what installation is, and move back, and here and there. And I really, well, now I'm starting to look a little bit like an artist, but I really don't look like this on a daily life, But I started to convince these people. 3/4 of my work is basically convincing people to trust and to understand the possibilities about putting together all these objects to create a visual translation of feelings of the community. And that's everywhere I go, I have to convince people of that. And they agree, so they lent me the caskets, and I placed them. We brought the temperature down to very, very cold, so when you came into the space, it felt very cold. And then together with a couple of people, we started to write quotes on the wall. It was almost as if he knew his days were counted. I don't know these things by heart. That was the very first time I saw a man cry. I still remember on his eyes, on his look, his wish for living. And every time I went and visit people, conversations and this quote from the conversation stayed with me. And that's how I build images throughout the work. So what happens is that this thing becomes really like an explosive installation. People come in, everyone in the community is coming in. I don't know how the word got out, and people from museums came in, and then the installation that I've been invited to was this one, which is a prominent museum in New York City. And for this one, I've worked with 2 detectives. And the detectives took me around everywhere and showed me crime scenes. I had this kind of a theory in my mind. I always start the installations with a question. And it's like, how are we seeing each other? How are we seeing each other the same way that other people see us? And then I began to think of that. And this is just basically the death of stereotype. It's actually a crime scene, because I was very intrigued by Hollywood portrays Latino families, and mostly women, as accessible objects. And how Latino families are seen always within this really square and limited characterization of who they are. So I wanted to see the real thing, and I told them, can you take me around? You will probably wonder how this happened, and I have to tell you, in retrospect, the access that I received from the installation of the Museo del Barrio allowed me to contact the detectives who then knew who I was, right? And so one thing, and I think this is just, it's calculated. One thing leads me to the other one. And so what happened was that I, after all these years, maybe about 7 years by now, not going to museums, not presenting work in major museums, I get to go to a mainstream place, a mainstream exhibition, that it was extremely controversial for many reasons, and still debatable. But the installation, what it did is that created also and I'm talking about the plateau, the tectonic referent linoleum floor. And that idea when I visited my aunt's house for the first time and I walked on linoleum floor, it's like, whoa, wow, this is amazing. We'd never seen linoleum floor before in the island. And so that was really something that caught my attention. Something that is just basically so tactily conceived by many people that have access and power, and for me it was a revelation. What it meant to live and experience a surface like no other one in New York City. And so that, and then all the fractures of the objects, and I had invited the detectives at the end. I invited the detectives to come and do an investigation of the process, because when we were in the car, I always asked them, if I have an ice pick and I stab someone, how does the blood flow? And then the guys will be just driving and looking back and looking at each other like, you have a gun or you don't know? And all these questions led to this extremely complicated installation that spoke not only of me, but it spoke to about a lot of people. That's the size of the piece. And on the other side, some of you might not even know what these things are, but they're called videotapes. And they came in a jacket, and there was a store called Blockbuster who rented them. And then on that, I put a lot of comments. On top, in front of the jacket of those videotapes, I put a lot of comments of people that I had spoken to about how they saw themselves in the movies, or how they saw themselves portrayed. The color red, if you live in a traditional family, and I'm also very much interested in anthropological aspects of my installation, because if you live in a traditional family, God forbid you sit on your father's chair at dinner. So the photograph was used as a way of also delineating hierarchy, but also at the same time delineating all these measures of controls in the family. I don't think I've ever said this, but this is a storyteller. Her name is Pura Belpre. It's really well-known Puerto Rican who decided to teach about storytelling. And it's really well-known in the Puerto Rican community. So Pura Belpre was the one, for so many people who didn't know her, she was the one who was telling the story about the scene of the crime. Sort of like telling the story, because she was the prominent image. More images. There is a whole thing that I'm not going to talk about today, but there's a whole thing about color and coding and white and red and all that connected to religious practice, but I won't talk about it today. So what these things lead me to was major exposure in one of the many art worlds that I belong to. And so what happens was that I'm like really excited, because I'm thinking, hey, I get to call those shots now. And then I go to my friend next door in the Bronx, whose story is basically displayed on the other side, with the New York Times. Big picture in the New York Times, on the Sunday New York Times. They trashed the show, but it was a big picture. And so I'm with the newspaper, and I'm going around, and I knock at the door, and, hey, Luisa, look! And she's like looking and dismay, like, huh? What's that? And I was like, the New York Times. And she said to me, Pipon, what the hell is the New York Times? And it dawned on me that hit me to realize that what I had been doing with the exhibition was basically gaining an opportunity for myself. but not really for the people that I was working with. And so it didn't mean shit to her, whether it was in the New York Times or in Vanity Fair. What it meant to her was that the piece was presented. And so that created a whole conflict, and it just also puzzled my reality, because I was thinking not as a citizen, I was actually thinking as an artist, right? And so from then on, and I'm saying this because from then on, I began to do a lot of work in the community. That's what it really made sense. I may work in community. I don't think my work is community arts necessarily, because it's a little bit more than that. I'm not afraid of the word community. But I'm also interested that I am working with people. We're collaborating on this notion of thinking of the museum space and how to occupy that space, right? Not as an artist, but as an entire community working together. And I'm also thinking that together we can all build the landscape of our memory in very specific moments in history. So La Barbería No Se Llora, No Crying Aloud in the Barbershop, is a piece about my childhood, my challenging of the family. I was 5 years old. My father took me to a barber shop. Oh wait, I gotta tell you how this thing ended up here. So from then on, I never presented work in a museum unless it had entered or had been seen in a storefront and in the community. And so as a way of creating that opportunities that were coming to me, as a way to diverging that opportunity to make sure that the people in the community had the chance to see the work, but also because the people who were becoming more and more curious in the so-called art world had to go to the community to see it first, had to go to the place, and so those kind of reversing that relationship somehow. So in La Barbería No Se Llora, I've worked with many people in that community. I began to work with barbers because I had to somehow manipulate the situation. They were very concerned that another barber shop was coming up in the neighborhood and relatively unknown, and I had no pedigree as a barber. And so they were questioning that. And then I finally told them, I'm doing an installation, I'm doing work, so here I am putting myself in a way of convincing people. And I decided that I was going to do my own story. The more that I think it's about the other, it's really about me. And the more that you think that the stories is about other people, it's somehow, somewhere, subconsciously, something that I have unresolved that needs to come out. The barbershop, I was 5 years old. My father was very proud. A little macho boy was coming up to get a haircut. I'm sitting there. I don't know who was in denial, probably the barber or my father, but I have kinky hair. You do not touch this hair other than in a way that it's not meant to be. And so I'm sitting there, and the guy's clipping my hair away, and he's killing me. And I am really, literally spitting tears and really, really angry. And my father was kind of like taken aback, and it was like he didn't know what was going on, but he really knew that the barber did not know how to cut kinky hair. And there was a moment in which they stopped. I was very traumatized, and my father said to me, you know, you don't cry in the barber shop. This is the place where men gather in the absence. 5-year-old, 2 foot nothing. This is the place where men gather in the absence of women. The whole thing is like, I don't give a shit. That guy gave me a terrible haircut, and I'm sure this has resonance with a lot of men in this room. So I decided to look at how men cried and videotape them. Actually, I didn't talk about this, and I can probably explain later how I got to video. But you see those 2 squares? Those men crying 24 hours, and people in the community were really pissed at looking at those guys crying. It was on a loop, and they were just crying and crying and crying. You walked into the space, pink wallpaper, Latinos on pink wallpaper. So that was another kind of a subtlety that was going on there. Men paid more attention to car parts than they paid to the family and women. So I put car parts everywhere. You come in, began to see little by little details of the cigarette. So the place looked really like a beauty parlor, but it was a barber shop. And now I brought a little bit of the so there's another reference, which is Baba Louaye, St. Lazarus. And St. Lazarus is the wooden men in Catholic Church. And that's what welcomed you. Actually, this is the entrance, and that's what actually welcomed you. There was a sea, really an ocean of images, and all of them flowing at the same time, extremely exaggerating. I'm going to tell you how I got to the exaggeration, because I think it's a little bit of important. I work in the South Bronx with a woman called Evelina Antonetti. Evelina Antonetti was the outmost activist in the South Bronx. Actually, her daughter passed away about a month ago. And Evelina Antonetti was really pissed off at the way that the institution was giving lunches to the poor kids. And one day she got really pissed off. She was my mentor. We're sitting next to each other. And one day she just got up, and out of nowhere, she went to the lunchroom, picked up all the bags of lunches and asked everybody to help out, almost as if I tell everybody here, like, okay, let's just pick up the lunch bags and then bring them to City Hall, and we dropped them in front of City Hall. And then we left a note in City Hall saying, we demand better nutrition. It was unbelievable. I'm saying this because when you saw the mountain of lunch boxes and lunches, you realized the impact that it had. And for me, it really caused like a really, it caused a profound experience. Not only to see one kid eating lunch, but to see how that lack of nutrition, how some of them even had worms, and they were like past due lunches were consumed by poor people, and we deserve the most. So from that experience, and you're going to see how it shows up later on, if I don't take that long, you will see how in my work there is a sense of shifting objects from one place to another. It's about moving objects that belong to a very specific, culturally specific object from one place to another as a way of exaggerating that reality, but at the same time creating consciousness around it. I'm going to show you another one. Oh, look at the ceiling, because this is really funny. I'm going to wake you up now. You see the ceiling were printed, similar to something like that, were printed. I don't know if you see it here. Yeah, frozen sperms. It was a very, very masculine thing. In conversation with this guy from the community, he just, this happens to me. Stories are everywhere, and somehow, somewhere, they come to me. And that's how I developed this species, right? And so the story was about this man who came to me and I says, you know, I have a fantasy as a man, very macho. I'm like, yeah, let's talk. We sat down, we talked, and he says, yeah, I have this fantasy. Are there any children in the house? No, right? All right. I have this fantasy that I will ejaculate and hit the ceiling. And I'm like, oh, you can't do that? No. And we kept talking about this idea that he had, and it stayed in the back of my mind. And this is what I'm talking about, the work, about the debris, and also the installation being a riverbank of all these conversations. So what happened was that he comes in, and I'll show you the videotape later. I'm not going to tell you who he is, but he comes in, and then he looks up on the ceiling. And he says, those are frozen sperms. And I say, yeah, and I did it. And we had a conversation about all these things of how also this can happen. I'm gonna see if I can show you. Oh man, let me see if this works. It's here. Okay, this is the opening. So during the opening, I had two barbers cutting hair. Actually, what else will a barber do? in front of the space, and we gave free haircuts. I don't know if you know what Baron Dandy is. It's like a terrible, terrible cologne. It smells like shit. And I broke Baron Dandy. Smells like really macho, disgusting thing. And I broke it in front of the door frame. And so as you're coming in, all you're smelling is this really serious cologne. And there he is, cutting hair. People were lining up, like seriously lining up, and he just gave like probably about 50 haircuts that day. There's Cherry Allen. And the installation. But anyway. So this is the very first time that people from the neighborhood where the work is created comes and see the exhibition first. And for me, was very rewarding to know that there was this place, and there was also a container for their ideas and the work. I'm going to be quick, as I think that I wanted to. View. Ooh, I might need help. No, maybe not. No. Okay. But then now, sorry guys. All right, so if anyone knows, tell me, turn it to the right, left, go left. One person only. Huh?
Slideshow, go to slideshow. Slideshow.
Here.
Play from current slide. Yeah.
Thank you. And just show you how old I am, just like that. Okay. I want to finish with this. 6:58. And so that got me really excited, and that piece, La Barbería No Se Llora, No Crying Aloud in the Barbershop, went everywhere, went really everywhere, traveled as far as Japan and back. And it's actually housed, if any one of you, in the next few years, don't go now, go to Puerto Rico, will be at the museum. It's a part of the collection of the Museo de Puerto Rico. But then Badge of Honor was, one of the things that I do is that I actually create a closure for the installations. I just don't take off. I sit there with the community, I talk to them, and then there's a process of closure, and all of them wanted the museum back. I kept thinking, that was not a museum, and it was really interesting. We were also talking about hours. And so I had to extend the hours that fit the community as opposed to the regular hours that people not necessarily are available. So Badge of Honor, I went with a video camera, which I'll give you a little context. I started meeting with a lot of young people in the community. This is commissioned by the Newark Museum. And I started to talk to a lot of kids about their fathers. In this piece, Marianne, my wife, is expecting her second son. And with the first one, I did well, but I'm like, what the hell is this? I couldn't even figure it out. And then the second one was about, the other one is growing, and I'm becoming a father, and this thing is serious. What do I do with it? So I don't know how that got mixed into the whole thing. I was in conversations with all these young people about what it meant to grow up in their communities. I realized that the majority of them men were absent, their fathers were absent, and we had a conversation, and then most of them told me, our fathers are in prison. This is during the Million Men March. So you can look back into, it's coming from here, it's connecting to this, but it's also connecting to this at the same time. And I became interested in working specifically with incarcerated fathers, as a way to connect and view the reality of that relationship that I had with my son and my family, seeing through somebody else's eyes. And I met him, and he came forward. I went with a carousel with slide projections to maybe about five prisons. And And finally he came forward and he said to me, I want to work with you. And I decided to work with him, and we started the conversation there. There's a lot of negotiation just before the work comes up, and which I'll explain a little bit about these ethical issues if I have time later. But then I started work with him, and his son became interested, and we invited him to be part of the group. And what we established was a triangular relationship between us. I used to work with a videographer. Her name is Irene Sosa, and I asked her if it was okay for both of us to go to prison and tape the father and then tape the son afterwards. So what I was saying before about the scene of the crime and the connections that I'm making, so it's getting a little bit more complicated, but I'm able to process and access the bureaucracy that comes up with that. They agree. I went with a video camera on my shoulder, built by Irene Sosa. With a video camera on my shoulder, I sat in front of the father. We put a white bed sheet around, and maybe some of you have seen this piece. And I just said one word to him. I said, we began with the word abuelo, which means grandfather, for those of you who don't speak Spanish. And the guy will just talk about abuelo, and he would just talk about abuelo, and then I was taping. I didn't react much, and then I went in the afternoon to the son's house, and we played it right in front of his TV set, and I was also recording his reaction, but he was talking to the father through the camera. And then the next morning, I went back and forth for about 3 weeks. The next morning, I went to the father. Well, this is what your son has to say about abuelo. Let's talk about absence. And that's what happened. It was a philosophical, actually it is a philosophical treaty between those two. But the viewer takes my position as an artist. When you're standing there, there's this triangular relationship. I don't know if you noticed that. This is triangular relationship where I'm not there physically, but you embody the creative process by standing in front of the work. And that's what I wanted to do. And then I follow a lot of feedback from people in Hartford, Connecticut, and you'll see it. This is the piece. Everything that I do, I've worked with people. I just basically went with the son, and we bought all that stuff. I sort of channel their needs, and then I begin to purchase things with them. This is not how the son's bedroom looks like. This is my perception of what I think looks like. If you hear the conversation, you will understand how they repeat over and over again all the belongings that they have and what it means to them. And then the father's cell, which is basically convincing the people in prison to lend me all the furniture that they have, which wasn't actually much, but all the furniture they had. So there's this conversation back and forth and negotiation all the time. And the sons. You see the entire, talking about the tectonic that I mentioned before, here it is again. I don't know why I'm obsessed with floors and this notion of the layering and shifting of layers on the floor. So all my installations, that's a given. I'm going to put, for those of you who haven't seen it, I'll put the, oh God, here we go. No, yes. Oh. Okay, I need help again. No, I did that and it's not going anywhere.
Press the green button.
Top?
Yep.
Thank you. There you go. You're so kind. This is out. Here it is. Press the green button again. And play.
Dad, Did Abuelo ever forgive you? He forgave me in the dream. And now that I really think about the question you asked me before, do I think my father forgave me? Yes, he did forgive me. He did forgive me because in the dream he forgave me. So I would say yes, he forgave me. And it was so beautiful, you know, to see your father after so many years not seeing him. I felt good. I was happy. I woke up happy that day. I was just like, I called mommy up, and I told her, Mom, you know, hon, I had a dream with my father, and it was something because I got to see him. I got to see him, you know. Just seeing him again was like, wow, you know. Well, Dad, there is one dream that I had about you, that like I was a cop and there was like I was going in with my squad for a drug bust, and you was like the dealer or whatever. And like once we got upstairs, like we caught everybody and like you ran, and I went after you, and then like once I saw you or whatever, like I just stopped, and like we both had our guns out, and you just dropped your gun and I dropped my gun, and then I don't know what happened, and we just hugged, and then I woke up. I hear you, Nelson, about your dream, and I think it was a real nice dream. And I want you to know that in this life, Nelson, if in order to live a good and straight life, you have to forgive. You have to forgive, Nelson. Well, Dad.
I think I'm going to leave it here, although I was hoping, but it's already an hour. And I was hoping to talk a little bit about Project Reform with also shifting materials from from a closed public school into the center of educational privilege, which is the Tyler School of Art and University at Temple. I will probably talk about this to the class tomorrow. But what I'm basically trying to do with my work is just raising a giant mirror, so then you can see yourself and we can see each other and begin to understand and have a conversation of what it means to be and to inhabit this world and community in such difficult times. Thank you. About
Talk a little bit about what you were going to keep going a little bit.
Sure. I'm mostly. I always think that the artwork is a pretext for something much bigger than just art, and I have been struggling with that. Struggling with it because I understand that for me, in order to make work survive in a way to maintain that the work and the complexities of my work, I have to negotiate a lot. And so what I have been thinking lately is just basically working with people that are mostly interested in change. And I'm not so sure where that takes me. I'll be very honest with you. There's two things, and I'm glad you're pushing me to this. There's two things. One, that I'm still fucking mad. And I'm really, really mad at the current situation as we are politically. But also that I'm very hopeful, you know, at the same time. And that contradiction, which to many of you might not sound like a contradiction, but sometimes you just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, is distracting me from the reality of action. And so when I started seeing and looking at people that probably don't have the same access that I have, and how they're suffering so much, and how dependent they are, and I'm basically talking a little bit about Puerto Rico right now. 300 schools closed last month. 300 public schools closed in the island. Before that, 47 had closed. So we're talking 347 schools. So there's no hope for education in the island, right? And so these contradictions constantly come in, and you're trying to figure it out. What will it take to make a work of art that speaks to people about moving forward, knowing that the dependency doesn't work anymore? And I'm talking about political dependency to the United States doesn't work anymore. And so in the middle of all that, you know, of course, I'm totally privileged. I'm here standing talking to you about it, you know. I'm not standing online, although I did come back from Puerto Rico recently. But it's hard. And it's hard for me because I think that I'm just trying to cut the bullshit. I'm trying to get to a place where exhibition is not at the center of what I do. That something else is at the center of what I'm interested in doing, and how to survive. But anyway, I don't even know if I answered the question. But I'd be happy to answer any question if you have. Thank you. I think there was a, I don't think we need a mic. Yes.
How did you get the resources to like interact with detectives and also like different government entities? How did you get that?
I'm obsessed with things. The resources to access them? Yeah. I'll go around and I keep asking and I keep asking and I keep asking and I keep asking and I keep asking, and people, the more the people say no, it's like, sure, it's going to happen. I tell you how it happened with the last work of Reform. I began to talk to the head of the, it's not Board of Education in Philly, it's called some school district. And I had access to the School Reform Commission. And I started to talk to them, and they gave me the turnaround and around and around, and they just kept going like crazy, talking about how it's not going to be, how I was not going to be able to have those. Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit and then just show you, even though if I'm not going to talk about the work, but I'll show you. And how I was not going to have access to any of this material that I needed to use. And so I just decided I'm going to talk to these guys. And this is the first time that I ever do this. Oh, you said view? No. What did you say? Huh?
Play from current slide.
Play from current slides. Okay. I'll just pass it. That's a school affair. Yeah. And so what I did is I told the guy, and then I finally talked to the right-hand side of the commissioner and said, if you don't give me those materials, which I know that you're discarding very soon, I'm going to go to the press and I'm going to make a big deal out of it. And I gave them a deadline, and they met the deadline. So little by little, I'm getting a little bit more aggressive, but usually it was like, okay, here, this one takes me that one. I give you everyone a piece of advice. If you're trying to talk to a welfare company or agency or any agency and the number is 8,000, always dial 8001. Don't dial 1,000 because they're not going to answer. 8001, 8002, those are the numbers where people are hiding behind, because if you dial 8,000, everybody's doing that at the same time. And so that's how I do it. And I'm just basically, I insist until I see it done. And I thread now, people. Institutions only, not people. Yes? Thank you.
So I noticed that in some of the installations that you showed, there's sort of a noticeable difference between two methods, I guess, of presenting installation. One was the one that depicted the sort of murder scene in the house. That way, where it sort of creates this invisible wall where you're sort of looking into it. I saw that piece, I believe it was the 1993 show at the museum. And then there's the barbershop piece where you can sort of walk in and sort of interact with. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these two different methods of interacting with these immersive installations.
Right. And the same with Badge of Honor, a couple of other pieces where you're not allowed to come in. And you're not allowed to come in because I think that I wanted to create a space of respect and a space where you encounter there's nothing sacred if it's exposed, right? I wanted to create a space of reflection. And by that I mean a space where you're standing there and you're not welcome, but you have to reflect. In the No Crying Aloud in the Barbershop in La Valeriana Sayora was basically about a collective experience. The scene of a crime was about one person experience. The father was two people's experience. When I think that the objects and or the threads of conversation becomes collective, that's when I open up the space for everyone to participate and be part of it. I'm just showing you slides at the process of
You mentioned that when you had your first retrospective, you kind of had that exposure. It was kind of like overwhelming, and now when you're creating art that is like very much so for your community and is so based upon people's vulnerabilities, how does sort of like contrasting with your like fame and the sort of like media frenzy that can kind of be swept into it, how does that tie into when you're making this like hyper-personal, sensitive sort of
I know.
work?
It's a fine line, and the good thing is that the majority of people that I collaborate with, they don't know that I'm an artist. Even though I tell them 20 times, I tell you the story about this thing. I've worked with 10 of these students that are here, 10 of them in that group. We work very, very tight together. And we worked for about a year. And I don't know how this happened. One of them went to the mural art project in Philadelphia and talked to someone there, and she said she was working with me. And he said, I can't believe you're working, he's a famous artist. And then the next morning she comes into the group and we're like, huh, you're famous, you didn't tell us. And so we began this conversation about that. I think that I began a conversation with them, but I think that the majority of them, of the people that I work with, understand the implications of the exhibition. What they don't understand is the rubble effects that it has in other people. But also because I present the work in the community setting first, it makes perfect sense to them to see it. And then the majority of the time I calculate these things very, very well. I become invisible. I know how to be in a crowd and like back off and become invisible and allow other people to take over. If talks come ask me for talk or people ask me for things, I usually pass them on. Like in Reform, I pass them on to the kids. So they're not kids anymore, but these young men, women. So they can do the talk, and then they just go. They already know how to do that and talk about the work and the process more than me, basically. That's them. Amazing, amazing kids. We gather people in the community in front of the school. Those are the teachers. We meet in restaurants all the time. The writing, everybody coming together. But I want to show you the installation. That's the beginning, that's it. That's the installation. Actual objects from the school that closed. And again, I was not prepared for this. I was just like in my mind, as a civic citizen, I was doing really well. As an artist, I wasn't prepared when I saw the first lady come into the space and went, wow, my daughter sat here. And she was literally sobbing, and I'm like, yes, it's true. I remember this chair. These are like 99% materials from the, except for those video projectors, 99% materials. Real, and in real life. See again the floor.
You were going to talk a little bit about ethics and working with the community.
I am also trying to balance a lot that. I also understand, and I ask people the repercussions of presenting work and what that means. But I also have to create a fine line. Which is really interesting with Reform, because we had a conversation. And at the end of the day, the conversation was at the very, very end of that exhibition. I posed the questions to the group and myself: was your education worth it? But in the process of it, I realized, and this is what I'm talking about ethics, I realized that the more that I wanted to see myself and understand of myself as someone who has privilege, I also understand that my education was not worth shit, right? And what that means is that we're all in the same boat. I just decided at some point to be self-taught. And that's what I was passing on to them, because I realized that also in this process, I have a serious responsibility as an artist. And these are the ethical issues that I have, and I have choices to make. And usually what I tried the best to do is to find ethical solutions where I see kind of a two-way relationship with the people that are very close to me. I don't work with communities, and by that I don't mean all those people that you see on those pictures participating in the entire process. I don't do that. I just work with very, very few people that I feel are symptomatics and also represent a much larger community. And those are the people that I keep seeing, and then, you know, yeah. And so that's what I do. I feel like I'm not answering your question, but there's a lot of responsibility on my side, you know, and I often feel that I have to create a balance. This work, Reform, I would never show it in a museum at all. Makes no freaking sense to show it in a museum at all. And I think that these are decisions that I make also with them. You know, what happens? We're thinking about other ways of presenting the work, but why would you want to present such a heavy process and so loaded installation that then becomes mere object in an exhibition space without the possibility of anything else? I'm going to show you this. He just did this. I just put the camera and he did everything. I didn't even prep him to do this. Brilliant kid. Which actually summarizes the entire installation. When we begin to have a conversation, when you ask me about the ethical issues, I'm constantly in conversations with the people that I work with, and I negotiate, as I mentioned before. And with them, any decision made with the exhibition has to be collective. It can't be my decision. It has to be collective. And as a way of determining how this thing is going to have a life of its own, I have another negotiation with the father and son, and with people that I work, little by little. You know, I start building things up only at the end of when the piece is made. And it's a way of creating some sort of a leverage and understanding how I approach not only my work, but my relationship with the commercialization of work, and that's not where I am, anyway. Yes?
Kind of along the lines of this. So you are obviously very involved in communities as both as a social worker and artist. I just want to know your thoughts on the role of art in the process of gentrification, and as artists, what we can do to stay involved and active.
I don't know how to answer that. But thank you for the question. Because I stay away from gentrification. I don't partake in that. I've seen too many people being hurt. But I also feel that times it's not my role as an artist in the community to engage in a conversation that is a life-threatening reality for some people and not for me. So I'm not sure how I can answer that question. Usually what I do, my role is just I'll just back off. I just let people take care of it. We've seen a lot, and I am actually at a university that has expanded itself tremendously around the neighborhood, and I've seen it happen. I do fight inside the university, and I make top administration who I'm close with know of the sentiment that the community has, and so I voice it. But I think that there's some things that I just can't get in the middle of it. I just go back again talking about this and those young kids. Young men, women of reform. I told them, I'll help you out, but I'm not going to do it for you. Whatever you wanted to do, I'll help you out. I swear I'll help you out. And so that's what I do. I'm just a standby. I'm there with them. They know that they can call me at any moment, but I'm not going to make the move. I'm not the one who's going to say, you should go to college. No. You want to go to college? You do it. I'll be there helping you out with whatever you need. You know what I'm saying? So I'm like always on the side. I'm never imposing the way that I think. Because I think that people have the ability to do that on their own. They just have had too much dependency on governmental structures in order to realize that they do have that possibility. Anywhere else? I just feel like I'm going around in circles yet.
I have a question about how you initiate with the community, especially with the Project Reform, and how your work in the past or your initiation in the past helped inform how you initiated with them.
I listened until I begin to build some sort of a visual imagery, and then we go from there. I bike everywhere, and so I got to the school by looking at this monster architecture that it was obsolete and going nowhere. And then I turned around and I was like, oh my God, all these people, their life, the way of crossing and relating to each other has changed because this structure is no longer functioning. And then I just began to think about that, and it was just in my mind. And then the what if. That's the other thing, what if? I ask myself that question all the time. Well, what if? What if? What if I bring the principal? What if I become, friends with the parents and we start talking about this? And so one thing leads to the other. But it's just basically listening to people, listening a lot to people. And I'm never pressured by the time that I have to make work. I don't know why. I'm never bothered with that. I think that's just, it's in me. And I trust that it's in me. And I just don't want to, I wanted to make sure that what I do is real and is justifiable. Yeah. Yes?
Thanks for the lecture. It was really, really fabulous to dive deep into a couple of your installations. I have a question about the afterlives of some of these installations. As you said, reform is not going to be kind of rearticulated in a museum show. And I felt really, I don't know, like I felt really lucky to be able to see Badge of Honor in the
I have a huge storage problem.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of part of my question, which is like I think some, and I'm sorry for taking so long.
No.
But I think some artists who work in immersive installations and then have to keep that work, then move to making smaller work, and I'm so grateful that you never kind of did that. And so I'm wondering, how do you manage the afterlife of these installations? Like, how do you ensure that when it's reinstalled, that it's installed in a way that stays true to the original installation, that, you know, does justice to the project as initially conceived? I think is kind of what I'm
Thank you. Badge of honor it's the only piece that I have, not because I want to, but because it hasn't I don't know why it hasn't sold, that piece. And I think that what I do is that I just demand. I have standards. That piece is going to Houston. I told them, like, if this is not it, I'm out. And I always say this to myself: do I need another show? I don't know. I don't think so. And that's how it works. But when it comes back to the studio, and I document everything by square inch. So I'm like a maniac when it comes to this. So everything is put back exactly the same way. You can look at these items exactly the same way, with an aerial camera, front. Some of them I can do with my eyes closed, like Badge of Honor. In 3 days, we're done. And some other ones take a little longer. But I want to talk a little bit about ethical issues. I want to talk a little bit about reform. And this is another challenge that I have, because I cannot see this work in a museum. It was actually in a classroom at Tyler School of Art. That's where everybody saw it. And it became an exhibition space. Then it became a place for the people in the community to come in and think about their own curriculum and being self-taught. And then also became a place of exhibition and a classroom. The students from Tyler took class in that room. And so after having that complex exhibition model, the exhibition in a museum just doesn't make any sense, right? I've been contemplating and asking people a little bit about Puerto Rico, because I want to bring it to Puerto Rico where the school closed, and then figured a way to show it in a public school that had been closed. But it's very complicated. And so then every idea that I have means that I'm just going to have this thing in storage forever until it can happen. But I've been really looking at that, thinking like, what if I just bring this thing to Puerto Rico and I build it with the students and we all get together and we're building in a school, in a classroom in a school, and it becomes a site where people can see it and be part of it. So that's where I'm at with it. And you know, looking at that as a possibility as a closed school, as a depository of exhibition.
So when you're sort of creating work about how like there should not be this or faith in like government institutions and this sort of reliance on that structure, but you're also tackling issues that are fundamentally like to make change in them, you need to interact with government institutions, like the flawed prison system, like the flawed school system, like ultimately it's the government that's going to have to be involved in some way. How do you sort of balance that, like, lack of faith in the very thing that you need to make change in these communities?
So do keep in mind that I am not working with large communities. I don't do zip codes, right? Keep that in mind. What I'm talking about is a very small group of people at the center that eventually, I hope I can't show you, like this, that. At the very, very center, that eventually will create an impact with the people that are around them, and then those people around them. And what I'm interested in doing is just basically connecting at that level. If I can bring critical thinking, if I can bring people to think, I'm very redundant, critically about their lives and about their situation, and then there is a little tiny of a possibility of change, they just have to activate that. That's where the work kicks in. That's where the artwork kicks in. I tell you, I don't know how I'm just keep ending up with reform because I'm so proud of it and the students. Reform became a catalyst for these young kids, right? And little by little, on their own, they decided, because they made all the connections, they decided that they were going to bring the School Reform Commission to see the exhibition. I didn't do anything. I backed up. Actually, I was somewhere else, out of the country, when they called me up and said, they're coming, Pepon, by email. They're coming, they're going to come and see, and see the exhibition. You know how they did it? They went to a public hearing with the School Reform Commission. They signed in, and publicly they invited, those are the kids that were left out, and those are the kids that were hopeless, and no one has hopes for them. And then they did. They went and had an open mic with the public hearing, and they were so impressed that they decided, well, we're going to come and see the show. And then they came to see the show. They could have been very nice to them, which actually they were, but at some point, some of them were crying. Her name is Linoshka, and Linoshka comes over and said to her, but they told me afterwards, I wasn't there, and even if I was in Philadelphia, I wouldn't have gone into that room. That was their part. And Linoshka said to her, you're crying. You should see my mother, how she cried when they closed the school. So I'm not going to feel very bad for you. Linoshka, who had never, ever made those connections, and I just was so proud of her, because it is the moment where all these constellations start working and they start making all these connections. And so I'm thinking, yeah, this is what this work does. But I am not, and I cannot go out there and work with masses of people. That's just not who I am. I know and I appreciate artists who do that. And also appreciate artists who go straight to the jugular with the institutions, and then they shake them, and I love that stuff. I can't do it. I just can't do it. I'm not that kind of I don't have that approach. And also artists who are just in for the money, I don't appreciate them, but I understand. Yes,
I can't remember if we actually ended up talking about it, but how did you get into using video, and how did you find that changing how you're interacting with the community, and how they're part of being part of the process and the installation itself?
Because I can't stay still, and so I started to have a very short process. I started painting, and I thought it was so boring, and then I went to printmaking, and then I just went into something else, and then finally I started combining them all together, but still it was very static, and I just felt like I needed something to move. And then that's when I thought about video. I'm not a very good video artist, to be honest with you. Looking at these things, I'm not really good. Most of my time is just standing still. But it's the context of what happens in those videos that makes it really good. And it's not because of me, it's because of the person that I'm working with does it really well. And that's what happened. I trust that, and I built that moment for that to happen. And so that's what happened. But I also, I don't think that my work relies on video to somehow summarize the installation. I don't think that's what happens. What happens is that it creates a rupture with these static elements, objects. And yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.